At 10 o'clock in the morning, on a bright, cloudless day in 1942, a lone American heavy bomber cruised at 25,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean. The aircraft, a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, drummed through the thin air on 4 vibrating engines. Inside the aluminum fuselage, the crew was freezing. At that altitude, the air was so cold it could turn sweat inside a flight suit into ice. Far below, cutting across the deep blue water, a Japanese destroyer moved steadily forward. From 5 miles up, it didn't look like a warship. It looked like a toy boat drifting in a bathtub, small, slow, almost harmless. In the nose of the bomber, the bombardier crouched over his most precious weapon, the Norden bombsight. This device was considered one of the most advanced pieces of technology in the American arsenal. Generals in Washington claimed it could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 30,000 feet. It was a mechanical brain of gears, gyroscopes, and lenses that calculated wind drift, airspeed, and gravity. The bombardier aligned the crosshairs with the thin white wake trailing the Japanese ship. He entered the numbers. He let the machine fly the airplane for the final approach. Then he pressed the release. A stick of 500-pound bombs tumbled from the belly of the aircraft. They fell for a long, agonizing time. From 25,000 feet, it takes nearly 45 seconds for a bomb to hit the surface. In combat, that's an eternity. The crew leaned toward the windows, watching the tiny specks shrink as they dropped, waiting for the explosion that would tear the enemy ship apart. On the ocean below, the Japanese captain calmly raised his binoculars. He didn't need a mechanical computer. He saw the small black dots separate from the bomber. He watched them falling. He lit a cigarette. When the bombs were halfway down, he gave a simple order to the helmsman. Hard left. The destroyer carved a clean white arc through the water. It shifted perhaps 100 yards off its original course, a slow, almost lazy maneuver. 45 seconds later, the American bombs slammed into the ocean exactly where the ship had been. Towering columns of white water erupted skyward. The shockwaves killed fish. The noise thundered across the sea. But the destroyer was untouched. It sailed on, engines humming, crew amused by the terrifying American bombers that couldn't hit the broadside of an island. This humiliating scene repeated itself again and again in the early Pacific War. The United States Army Air Forces had built its doctrine around high-altitude precision bombing. The theory was simple: fly high enough to stay safe from anti-aircraft guns, use the Norden bombsight, and destroy targets with mathematical certainty. Manuals were written. Factories produced thousands of heavy bombers. Young crews were trained to trust the equations. But reality refused to cooperate. Ships moved. Winds shifted. Clouds obscured visibility. Targets zigzagged. The pickle barrel accuracy was mostly a laboratory fantasy. In combat, bombs worth millions of dollars were splashing harmlessly into empty ocean. Navy aviators who flew low-level torpedo attacks mocked the Army crews. They called it hole-in-the-water bombing. They joked that the safest place in a naval battle was directly under a high-flying bomber. Infantrymen waiting desperately for air support were even harsher. They stopped looking up when they heard heavy engines overhead. Experience told them nothing was going to be hit. The frustration spread like rust. Bomber crews risked everything. Long overwater missions, enemy fighters, flak bursts tearing at their wings, only to watch their bombs fall uselessly into the sea. They felt powerless, embarrassed, and while American bombs missed, Japanese forces maneuvered freely. By early 1943, the stakes escalated from frustrating to catastrophic. Intelligence reports revealed that Japan was assembling a major convoy, 8 transport ships carrying nearly 7,000 fresh troops, along with fuel, artillery, and ammunition. They were escorted by 8 destroyers, fast, heavily armed warships bristling with anti-aircraft guns and torpedoes. Their destination lay on the island of New Guinea. If those reinforcements landed, they would strengthen Japanese positions already locked in brutal combat against Australian and American forces. The fragile stalemate would collapse. Allied troops could be driven into the sea. If New Guinea fell, the defensive line shielding Australia would fracture. The entire Southwest Pacific could unravel. In his headquarters, General George Kenney studied the map. Kenney commanded the Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific. He was blunt, impatient with bureaucracy, and deeply skeptical of rigid doctrine. He didn't care about manuals drafted in Washington. He cared about results. And he understood one brutal truth. If he sent his B-17s and B-25s to bomb that convoy from 20,000 feet, the bombs would fall into empty water. And the Japanese would land 7,000 troops. The Japanese ships would simply turn. The troops would land. The war would be lost. Kenney needed a way to hit a moving ship so hard it would never get back up. He needed accuracy, but accuracy meant getting close. And every rule in the book said that getting close to a destroyer was suicide. A destroyer was essentially a floating anti-aircraft fortress. It bristled with 20mm cannons and heavy machine guns. If a bomber flew low and straight toward it, the aircraft became a massive, slow-moving target. The Japanese gunners would rip it apart before it even had the chance to release its bomb. And even if the pilot survived the wall of gunfire, there was another problem: the bomb itself. Aerial bombs were designed to fall from altitude. Their fuses armed themselves as they spun through the air. Drop a bomb from 50 feet and it didn't have time to arm. It would slam into the ship like a giant dud. Worse still, if it did explode that close to the aircraft, the blast wave could tear the tail off your own plane. The manual was clear. Low-level bombing against ships was impossible, reckless, and stupid. But Kenney kept thinking about something from his childhood. Skipping stones across a pond. He thought about the physics. When you throw a flat stone at a shallow angle, it doesn't sink. It bounces. It schemes across the surface, hopping over the ripples until it smacks into the far bank. He wondered, what if a 500-pound bomb could do the same thing? The idea sounded insane. He wanted his pilots to take heavy twin-engine B-25 Mitchell bombers down to deck level. Not at 1,000 feet. Not at 500 feet. He wanted them at 50 feet, mast height. He wanted them flying 250 miles per hour straight at a Japanese destroyer and dropping a bomb into the water 60 yards away. If his theory worked, the bomb wouldn't sink. It would hit the water, skip back into the air like a stone, leap over the torpedo nets, and slam directly into the steel hull. Not the deck, the waterline. It would rip a hole in the side of the ship that no damage control team could repair. It would be a torpedo traveling at the speed of an airplane. When he presented the idea to the experts, the staff officers, the doctrine men, they went pale. They called it murder. They said the B-25 wasn't built for that kind of stress. They said the pilots would be flying straight into the barrels of enemy guns. They said the bombs would detonate instantly on contact with the water and blow the planes out of the sky. They listed a dozen reasons why it couldn't be done. And they weren't wrong about the danger. Flying a bomber at 50 feet above the ocean is terrifying. The water blurs beneath you. One small mistake on the controls and you cartwheel into the waves. Flying straight at a destroyer means staring directly at the men trying to kill you. There's no evasive maneuvering. No elegant dogfighting. It's a brutal game of chicken, aluminum versus steel. But Kenney looked at the reports of failed high-altitude attacks. He looked at the Japanese convoy heading toward Lae. He realized he didn't have a choice. The safe method wasn't working. The proper military way had failed. He had to rewrite the rulebook. He needed pilots brave or crazy enough to try it. And he needed a mechanical genius capable of making it possible. The B-25 Mitchell was a solid aircraft, designed as a medium bomber with a glass nose so a bombardier could sit up front and aim through a sight. It wasn't built for a low-level knife fight. It didn't have heavy forward firepower. If a pilot flew that glass nose straight at a Japanese destroyer, the bombardier would be dead within seconds. Kenney didn't just need a new tactic. He needed a new airplane. He needed to strip out the glass, remove the unnecessary weight, and pack the nose with enough firepower to suppress enemy deck guns. He needed to turn a polite medium bomber into a street fighter. The order went out. The mission was top secret. The deadline was yesterday. A massive Japanese convoy was steaming south, carrying 7,000 soldiers. Kenney bet his entire reputation on a tactic that involved skipping explosives across the ocean like children throwing rocks at a lake. The experts said it was impossible. The manual said it was forbidden. But General George Kenney was about to prove that, in the Pacific, the only rule that mattered was hitting the target. Kenney had the idea, but he still didn't have the airplane. The standard B-25 Mitchell was a well-behaved bomber, designed to cruise at medium altitude where the crew could check maps and drink coffee. Its glass nose offered perfect visibility for a bombardier. In a low-level brawl against a destroyer, that glass nose was nothing more than a greenhouse waiting to shatter. Kenney needed a man who could look at a factory-built airplane and see a weapon. He found him in Major Paul Pappy Gunn. Gunn was already a legend in the Pacific. He wasn't a polished West Point officer. He was a former enlisted naval aviator who had flown fragile aircraft over the jungles of the Philippines before the war. He knew engines better than he knew people. He walked with a cigar in his mouth and grease beneath his fingernails. When Kenney told him he wanted to turn the B-25 into a ship killer that could fly at 50 feet and sink destroyers, Gunn didn't ask for factory approval. He asked for a welding torch. The first problem was firepower. If a B-25 was going to fly straight at a Japanese warship, it had to overwhelm the gunners. It needed to pour so much lead onto the deck that enemy sailors would be forced to duck instead of shoot. The standard B-25 had a single-nose machine gun, barely more than a pea-shooter. Gunn rolled the bombers into hangars in Australia. He ripped off the glass noses and replaced them with solid metal panels. Then he began cutting openings. He installed 4 heavy .50 caliber machine guns in the nose. Then he added more blister packs mounted on the fuselage sides. When he was finished, the polite bomber was gone. In its place stood a flying gun battery. 8 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns, each capable of firing roughly 800 rounds per minute. When the pilot squeezed the trigger, the aircraft unleashed a storm of armor-piercing incendiary rounds, thousands per minute. It wasn't just armed. It was a chainsaw in the sky. But adding guns was the easy part. The real challenge was the bomb. The real challenge was the bomb. Skip bombing demanded terrifying precision. Drop too high, and the bomb plunged straight into the sea. Drop too low, and it might hit flat and ricochet back into your own fuselage. There was no margin for error. Just 50 feet of altitude, 250 miles per hour, and a narrow window between genius and disaster. And if you released the bomb at the wrong speed, it might simply skid across the surface and stop before ever reaching the target. Kenney and his team had to find the perfect balance, the Goldilocks zone. They moved their experiments to a quiet bay near Port Moresby, where a rusty shipwreck called the Pruth sat stranded on a reef. That wreck became their laboratory. Day after day, they practiced dropping bombs and studying the results, trying to solve the equation. Eventually, they found the magic numbers, 200 miles per hour, roughly 200 feet from the target, and most critically, an altitude of about 50 feet. 50 feet is nothing. The wingspan of a B-25 Mitchell is 67 feet. That meant they were flying lower than the width of their own airplane. At that height, the ocean isn't a calm blue sheet. It's a violent blur of whitecaps and spray rushing beneath you. Every instinct screamed at the pilots to pull up. Their bodies were certain they were about to crash. They had to lock their elbows, stare at the horizon, and trust their instruments. Then came the fuse problem, the issue that kept the experts awake at night. Standard bomb fuses were impact fuses. They detonated the instant they struck something solid. If a skip bomb hit a wave and exploded immediately, the blast would erupt directly beneath the aircraft. The bomber would destroy itself. They needed a delay, but they didn't have special skip bombing fuses. So they improvised. Major Paul Pappy Gunn and the ordnance crews modified standard fuses. They adjusted chemical timers and experimented until they achieved a delay of roughly 4 to 5 seconds. 5 seconds doesn't sound like much, but in skip bombing, 5 seconds meant survival. It allowed the bomb to strike the water, skip upward, smash into the hull, punch deep inside the ship, and only then explode. Those few seconds gave the pilot just enough time to pull back on the stick, roar over the ship's mast, and escape the blast radius. The training was brutal. The pilots of the 5th Air Force were used to flying high above danger. Now they were being told to skim the ocean like reckless daredevils. They practiced against the wreck until they could place a bomb through the same hole in its hull repeatedly. They learned to judge wave height at a glance. They learned to ignore salt spray hammering their windshields. They learned to suppress fear. And they had to adapt to the guns. Pappy Gunn's 8-gun nose turned the B-25 into a monster. When a pilot fired a sustained burst, the recoil actually slowed the aircraft in midair. The vibration was so violent it rattled their teeth. Rivets popped from the aluminum skin. The airplane felt as if it were tearing itself apart. But the damage it inflicted was devastating. When they tested the .50 caliber guns against the wreck, the rounds didn't merely punch holes. They shredded steel plating like wet cardboard. By late February 1943, the modifications were complete. The commerce destroyers were ready. The pilots were ready. But no one knew if it would work in real combat. Attacking a stationary wreck on a reef was one thing. Attacking a maneuvering Japanese destroyer at 30 knots, firing high-explosive shells back at you, was something else entirely. Meanwhile, the Japanese convoy was closing in. Reconnaissance planes spotted it entering the Bismarck Sea. It was a massive force. 8 transport ships heavy with troops and supplies, escorted by 8 sleek destroyers circling like wolves. Overhead, dozens of Zero fighters formed a protective umbrella. It was a floating fortress. On the morning of March 2nd, the first test came. Several B-17s tried the traditional high-altitude method. They dropped bombs from the clouds and hit nothing but water. The convoy continued south untouched. Japanese commanders radioed Tokyo confidently. The Americans were incompetent. They believed they would reach La by the next day. But the weather was changing. The storm front that had blanketed the region began to break apart. On the morning of March 3rd, the clouds lifted. The Bismarck Sea lay open and exposed. General Kenney gave the order, "Weather's clear. Go get them." Across airfields in New Guinea, the engines of the modified B-25s roared to life. Propellers blurred. The sound was thunderous. These were no longer ordinary bombers. They were flying warships. The pilots taxied out with fuel tanks full and 500-pound bombs secured in their bays. They checked their gun switches. They checked the modified fuses. Then they took off. They didn't climb to 20,000 feet. They stayed low, hugging the jungle canopy before dropping down over open water. They were hunting. As they approached the convoy, Japanese lookouts spotted the dark shapes on the horizon. The destroyer crews assumed the Americans would pull up and begin a conventional bombing run. That was the rule. That was how it was always done. But the shapes didn't climb. They came in lower, faster. Japanese captains ordered anti-aircraft batteries to fire. The sky filled with black bursts of flak. Shells splashed violently around the approaching aircraft. The B-25s flew straight through it. The pilots shoved the throttles forward to the firewall. Engines screamed at maximum power. The sea below blurred into a solid sheet of gray. Leading the formation was Major Ed Lerner, flying directly at the lead destroyer. He was the test case. He had to prove General Kenney wasn't insane. Lerner leveled off at mast height. The destroyer grew rapidly in his windshield. He could see flashes from enemy guns. He could almost see the faces of the gunners firing at him. He didn't flinch. When the ship filled his entire view, he flipped the switch for the 8 forward guns. The B-25 shuddered violently as the nose erupted in fire. Streams of tracers lashed out, hammering the destroyer's bridge, smashing glass, cutting down gunners, forcing sailors to dive for cover. Then, at the last possible second, Lerner hit the bomb release. The 500-pound bomb dropped cleanly from the belly. It didn't tumble. It struck the water. It hit the water with a sharp splash and skipped. The 500-pound bomb that Major Ed Lerner released didn't look especially dangerous at first. It struck the sea about 60 yards in front of the Japanese destroyer Aviation. A normal bomb would have vanished beneath the waves, sinking harmlessly before exploding. But this bomb refused to sink. It hit the surface of the Bismarck Sea at 200 miles per hour and bounced. It leapt off the water like a flat stone thrown by a giant, arcing upward in a shallow trajectory. It cleared the torpedo nets. It passed beneath the depression angle of the ship's heavy guns. Then it slammed directly into the steel hull at the waterline. For 4 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The modified fuse that Pappy Gunn's mechanics had engineered was ticking. The bomb was now deep inside the ship, perhaps in the engine room, perhaps near the magazine, waiting. The B-25 roared over the destroyer's mast so low that the rear gunner could look down and see the stunned faces of sailors on the bridge. Then the timer expired. Aviation didn't merely explode. It broke. The blast snapped the keel. A massive column of water, oil, and torn steel erupted hundreds of feet into the air. The destroyer lurched to a dead stop, her back broken, flames pouring from her shattered interior. That single explosion changed naval warfare in the Pacific. The so-called suicide tactic wasn't suicide for the pilots. It was suicide for the ships. General Kenney's gamble had paid off. And now the rest of the squadron surged through the opening Lerner had created. The sky filled with the thunder of Wright Cyclone engines as wave after wave of modified B-25s dropped to deck level. They came in like a swarm of angry wasps, lining up on the Japanese convoy. The Japanese gunners tried to track them, but the bombers were too low and too fast. Heavy anti-aircraft shells, fused to explode at high altitude, screamed overhead and detonated uselessly far above the water. Then the commerce destroyers opened fire. This was the moment when Pappy Gunn's mad scientist modifications turned the battle into a massacre. As the bombers approached, they unleashed all 8 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns. The sound was a continuous, tearing roar. Streams of tracers formed solid bars of fire linking aircraft to ship. Standard anti-aircraft doctrine assumes gunners can remain at their posts and return fire. No human being can stand against 8 heavy machine guns firing thousands of rounds per minute. American tracers swept across the destroyer's decks like a high-pressure hose. Bridge glass shattered. Gun shields crumpled. Anti-aircraft pits became death traps. Sailors were cut down before they could even swing their weapons into position. The return fire simply stopped. The B-25s weren't just bombing. They were suppressing entire warships through sheer brute force. Then came the bombs. Pilots released them with terrifying precision, so close to their targets they could hardly miss. One B-25, skimming barely 20 feet above the waves, skipped a bomb into the side of the destroyer Tokitsuke's. The explosion ripped a hole in the hull the size of a garage door. The ship listed violently, throwing men into oil-slicked water. Another bomber lined up on the destroyer Aviation. The pilot waited until the vessel filled his windshield, then released 2 bombs in perfect sequence. They skipped together and detonated deep inside the ammunition magazine. The ship vanished in a blinding white flash. When the smoke cleared, only debris rained down onto the sea. Within minutes, the supposedly invincible destroyer screen was shattered, burning, sinking, or drifting helplessly. The troop transports were now completely exposed. They were large, slow, and packed with thousands of soldiers. They were sitting ducks. The B-25s shifted their focus. It was no longer a battle. It was an execution. The bombers formed a deadly production line. They lined up on a transport, roared in at mast height, raked the decks with machine gun fire, and skipped bombs into the hulls. Then they banked hard and did it again. The transports had little armor. The explosions tore them open like tin cans. The scene became apocalyptic. The sea burned with oil and wreckage. Thousands of Japanese troops, once bound for New Guinea, now fought for survival in flaming water. The B-25s flew so low that oil spray splattered their windshields, oil from the ships they had just destroyed. Some aircraft returned to base with fragments of ships embedded in their engine cowlings. One came back with part of a Japanese radio antenna wrapped around its wing. That was how close they were. Japanese air cover finally dove to intervene. High above, a 6M0 fighters plunged toward the attackers. But the Americans had brought escorts, P-38 Lightning fighters, twin-boom interceptors that looked like devils in the sky. A massive dogfight erupted overhead, twisting through the clouds. Down on the deck, the bombers ignored it. They focused on the ships. They focused on the skip. The physics proved even deadlier than Kenney had imagined. Some bombs skipped cleanly into hulls. Others bounced entirely over ships, clearing railings by inches before splashing beyond, terrifying even in near miss. The psychological shock was devastating. Japanese crews were being attacked by aircraft behaving like torpedo boats. They had no defense. One moment captured the chaos perfectly. A B-25 named Eager Beaver made a run on a large transport. His pilot held fire until point-blank range. Then he opened up with the nose guns, sawing across the bridge. He released the bomb, skipped once, struck the waterline, detonated. The blast was so powerful it lifted the entire 6,000-ton ship clear of the sea. The hull snapped. As the bomber roared overhead, the rear gunner poured fire into the sinking wreckage. In less than 60 seconds, a major transport became a burning reef. The noise was overwhelming. Engines screaming, machine guns hammering, bombs thundering, men shouting and dying. The ocean churned into white foam streaked with red. Sharks, drawn by vibration and blood, began circling the wreckage. The Japanese troops had expected safe passage to Lae. Instead, they found themselves in a shark-infested sea beneath a storm of American steel. As the morning wore on, predictions that the B-25s would fall apart proved spectacularly wrong. They took hits. They absorbed small arms fire. They endured shrapnel from their own bomb blasts. But they did not break. Pappy guns' modifications held. The solid metal noses absorbed impacts. The airframe stayed intact even as pilots yanked high G-turns to clear ship masts at the last possible second. The so-called impossible tactic had become unstoppable. The polite medium bomber had become the toughest street fighter in the Pacific. By noon, the convoy had ceased to exist. All 8 troop transports were sinking or already gone. 4 of the 8 destroyers had been obliterated, and the remaining ships were limping away, trailing smoke and fire. The victory was so overwhelming that American pilots began running out of targets. They circled over the wreckage, searching for anything still afloat. They strafed lifeboats. They strafed barges. It was brutal work, ugly work, but General Kenney had issued strict orders. He did not want Japanese troops reaching shore. Every soldier who survived the swim was a soldier who might kill an American later. The pilots flew until their ammunition bins were empty and their fuel gauges dipped toward red. Then they turned back toward New Guinea, leaving behind total devastation. The Bismarck Sea, calm and blue that morning, had become a graveyard. Smoke from burning ships rose thousands of feet into the sky, a black tombstone marking the death of the Japanese offensive. Back at base, ground crews waited nervously. They counted the returning aircraft. They searched the horizon for missing silhouettes. The experts had predicted catastrophic losses, a 20 to 30% casualty rate for low-level bombing. But the planes kept coming back, battered, riddled with holes, reeking of smoke and oil, but flying. Pilots climbed from their cockpits with sweat-soaked flight suits and trembling hands. Adrenaline still surged through them. In the debriefing huts, they told stories that sounded impossible. They spoke of bombs skipping like stones, of seeing the color of Japanese captains' eyes, of explosions so close that the blast waves lifted their aircraft like invisible hands. General George Kenney listened carefully. He studied reconnaissance photographs as they were developed. The images showed ships burning from bow to stern, ships broken clean in half, vast oil slicks spreading across the sea. The suicide tactic hadn't merely worked. It had rewritten the rules of air warfare. The era of high-altitude guesswork was over. The era of the skip bomber had arrived. And as the smoke cleared over the Bismarck Sea, the true scale of destruction became clear. Japan had not simply lost ships. It had lost an army at sea. Later that afternoon, General Kenney walked into the communications room holding a piece of paper that would silence every critic in Washington. The final pilot reports were in. The photographs confirmed everything. Experts had predicted failure. They had predicted shattered bombers. They had predicted bombs bouncing harmlessly into open water. They were wrong on every count. Kenney drafted a telegram to General Douglas MacArthur and the leadership in Washington. He used no dramatic language, no exaggeration, no hedging. He simply stated that the convoy was gone. His commerce destroyers had sunk virtually everything that floated. Thousands of Japanese troops had been sent to reinforce New Guinea, and almost none had arrived. The sea was empty. At first, officials in Washington struggled to believe it. It sounded like propaganda. No air force in history had ever annihilated a major naval convoy without suffering crippling losses. It seemed too perfect. They demanded proof. So Kenney sent the photographs. Black and white images that could not lie. Destroyers snapped in half, bows pointing skyward. Transport ships burning from end to end. Oil slicks stretching for miles. The truth was undeniable. The skip bombing tactic had not just succeeded, it had achieved near perfection. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was more than a victory. It was a door slamming shut. Japan lost 8 transport ships and 4 destroyers. Nearly 3,000 soldiers were killed, elite troops desperately needed on the front lines. Tons of supplies, fuel, and ammunition vanished beneath the sea. But the greatest loss was something less tangible: control of the ocean. Before the battle, Japanese commanders believed they could move troops wherever they pleased. Their destroyers were considered invincible guardians. After the battle, they understood the truth. Any ship that entered the range of Kenney's skip bombers was signing its own death warrant. The psychological impact was devastating. Commanders in Rabaul were stunned. Reinforcing New Guinea by sea was no longer viable. The thousands of Japanese troops already stranded on the island were effectively cut off. They would starve. They would run out of ammunition. They would wither on the vine. The Japanese Navy never again attempted a large convoy to New Guinea. Supplies were trickled in by submarine under cover of darkness, a few tons at a time. It wasn't enough. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea effectively secured the New Guinea campaign long before the final ground battles were fought. It saved thousands of Australian and American lives by preventing 7,000 fresh enemy reinforcements from ever reaching the battlefield. Back in the Allied hangars, the mood had transformed. The fear was gone. In its place was confidence, even swagger. The impossible had been attempted, and it had worked. The pilots of the 5th Air Force walked a little taller after that day. They weren't the hole-in-the-water guys anymore. They were the mast-height killers. They painted ship silhouettes on the noses of their B-25s. They had earned the respect of the Navy, the infantry, and even the enemy. Quietly, back in Washington, the experts rewrote the manuals. The ban on low-level bombing was lifted. In fact, skip bombing became standard. It spread across the globe, used in the Mediterranean, used in the Atlantic. The tactic that had been labeled suicide in 1942 became doctrine by 1943. Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn, the man with the cigar and the welding torch, became a legend. He proved you didn't need an advanced engineering degree to build a war-winning weapon. You needed practical sense. You needed imagination. And you needed the courage to ignore the rulebook when the rulebook was wrong. His heavy-nosed B-25, the one that shook so violently it rattled teeth, became the most feared strafer in the Pacific. It paved the way for future gunships, proving that sometimes the best way to use an airplane is to treat it like a flying shotgun. General George Kenney earned his vindication. He had gambled his career on a childhood memory, a stone skipping across water. He trusted physics. He trusted his mechanics. Most importantly, he trusted his pilots when others doubted them. He proved something timeless about warfare. The safe way is often the most dangerous way because it drags the war on. The dangerous way, flying at 50 feet, staring down gun barrels, can be the safest of all because it ends the fight quickly. The legacy of the skip bombers still echoes today. Innovation rarely happens in sterile laboratories. It happens in mud, sweat, and grease. It happens when desperate men stare at a problem and refuse to accept the standard answer. The B-25 pilots didn't have precision-guided munitions. They didn't have laser targeting systems. They had iron bombs and a stopwatch. And with those simple tools, they achieved a level of accuracy that even modern systems would respect. If you dive into the depths of the Bismarck Sea today, the wrecks are still there, rusted skeletons resting in darkness. They are monuments to the day doctrine failed and daring prevailed. They are silent witnesses to a handful of young men who strapped themselves into aluminum machines and played chicken with the Imperial Japanese Navy. The story of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea is more than a war story. It is a lesson in defiance. It reminds us that when experts say something is impossible, they often mean it simply hasn't been done yet. It proves that one bold idea, executed with precision and force, can outweigh volumes of cautious doctrine. We tell these stories so men like General Kenney, Pappy Gunn, and Major Ed Lerner are not forgotten. They represent a generation that faced impossible odds with a wrench in one hand and a throttle in the other. If the story of the commerce destroyers and their impossible flight moved you, consider supporting the channel. It helps keep these stories alive and ensures that forgotten history is never truly forgotten. And here's a question for you. General Kenney ignored the manuals and overruled the experts to win this battle. He approved a tactic considered suicidal by doctrine. In today's modern military, with layers of oversight, regulations, and safety protocols, could a commander do the same? Could someone modify aircraft in a hangar and authorize 50-foot attack runs against regulations? Or would bureaucracy shut it down before the first engine started? Let me know what you think. Is innovation worth the risk? Or has modern warfare become too cautious to allow breakthroughs like this? Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping preserve the legacy of the skip bombers.